This topic is, I guess, close and dear to me, reimbursement strategy. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, access, worldwide access for our oncology portfolio at Genentech. And it's something that's becoming increasingly important, not only in oncology, but in most therapeutic areas, and really trying to understand the perspective of not only getting regulatory approval is important, but really thinking about how you make sure your product gets in the hands of patients is even more important. When thinking about this topic, trying to think about who would be the best person to give you an overview, and that was a pretty easy thing for me to determine. So we have here with us Scott Howell, who's the head of patient access or access solutions at Genentech, which is the best program in our country. I've worked with Scott on a number of task force and projects, and I have really tremendous appreciation for his intellect, depth of expertise, his ability to really think outside of the box and problem solve. He's a physician, and so he treated patients, but also later on become an executive in the payer industry, so he knows how payers think. He then switched sides and worked on an industry and sort of negotiating on the other side. He's a master negotiator as well, man of many talents. And now he's making sure that some of the best products and new products in the country or the world are getting in the hands of patients. So please join me in welcoming Scott Howell. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Dominic. It's great to see you here, and it's great to be working with you again at this wonderful conference today. I'm really looking forward to our section now on the reimbursement environment. It's going to be a bit of a change of gears, I think, for some of the things that you've covered yesterday and certainly from the first session today, but hopefully there'll be some information here that will be of interest and perhaps a few aha moments as well. I'd like to, before we get started, I'd like to thank Jennifer Cazone from my team at Genentech, actually, who's worked with me today to help prepare some of the remarks and some of the discussion we'll have with the panelists here as we go. I've subtitled my initial remarks here, Think Twice. I've done this for a couple of reasons. I think the reimbursement environment is oftentimes a bit more complex than folks may understand initially. It's also something that I think, though we have some opportunities in, there are some strategic levers that are available to us, and so understanding those and the value that they can bring in bringing your product to the market and affording its access to the patients who need it is also worth thinking twice and thinking deeply about as well. I'm going to start today with a brief overview of the reimbursement environment that will underscore that complexity. Then I'll introduce to you then, I think, a very simple framework for thinking about these somewhat complex levers in a goal of being able to categorize these things easily in your minds as you think about them. And then we'll close with a final few words of advice to life sciences entrepreneurs. Okay, so at first blush, what's so hard about this, right? It seems fairly straightforward. The product flows are from the manufacturer through a distribution chain to a healthcare provider and then ultimately into the hands of the patients. And the financial flows are really just kind of the reverse in that. And so there is a sort of simplistic model for thinking about this and might lead one to believe that this could be a straightforward proposition and something that we could navigate quite easily. The reality is, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's actually much more complicated than this. There are lots of stakeholders and channel partners throughout the value chain, each of whom is playing a different role, has a different point of view about things, and moreover is trying to extricate their value from the value chain in a different way as well. And so understanding the nuances makes a big difference. Starting with the most basic nuance is and I'm speaking primarily from a biopharm company's point of view, but we'll have some panelists here that will share some others, right? But is your product a small molecule or something that's reimbursed on the pharmacy benefit side, and if so, it's got one set of flows and stakeholders and financial transactions, or is it on the other side a product that's a medical benefit buy and bill product that's administered in the healthcare providers? And that will have a whole set of different flows and a whole set of different stakeholders. And so In one set of instances, you may be working with whole line distributors and another specialty distributors, retail pharmacies versus specialty pharmacies. What role do pharmacy benefit management companies play, GPOs, and the like? And so the reality is here, there's a lot of nuance, and getting it right makes a big difference in terms of access and profitability for your product. All right, now let's take a look at the framework. I'm going to break things down into 3 areas, 3 buckets, 3 critical areas that you should think about in terms of your reimbursement strategy. Starting up front with your value proposition of your product and the supporting evidence that you develop to help support that with payers. This will help them drive, or help you drive with them, the most favorable payer policy decisions that can be made, so you get the best, broadest coverage and access up front, right? Then there's a series of things that you need to think about as you come to market with your product. Pricing, contracting, and distribution are the most important levers in your go-to-market package when it comes to access and reimbursement and profitability. And there's some trade-offs there. It's an optimization exercise, oftentimes not a maximization one. And then lastly, even when you get those things as right as you can, the insurance system in the U.S. is complex, it's fragmented, there are gaps, people fall through the cracks, and depending upon your product and the space you're in, it can make a lot of sense for you to help individual patients navigate the system and pull them through with a lot of hand-holding, one by one, with reimbursement and patient assistance programs. So let's walk through each of these areas and the levers. We'll start with the value proposition. And again, in the spirit of think twice, a starting assumption might be, if I'm thinking about a marketeer at a place like Genentech, right? I've got a great product, I've got great clinical trial data, I've got great safety and efficacy. Won't that be enough to get me covered well with the payer environment? And sometimes it will. It depends. But it's important to understand that payers are thinking, they are interested in, of course, your clinical trial data and the safety and efficacy profile, but their role as an intermediary is really much more of a financial role, right? They're acting on behalf of individuals and employer groups, trying to help people figure out how to finance their health care and keep it affordable. And so they're interested not only in the clinical information, but also the economic information, and it's the ratio of those things that creates the value proposition for them. So they are going to be interested in your clinical trial data and your target product profile and all those things. They're also going to want to talk to you, though, about the economic information side of the equation, your net price and any pharmacoeconomic data you may have or be able to develop. And importantly, not all payers are alike. And it's important to understand the segmentation of your market. You may have public payers, such as Medicaid and Medicare, and private payers, such as commercial health plans like Aetna and United, and the Blues plans. If you're a pharmacy product, pharmacy benefit managers are going to be important stakeholders for you. And with the recent healthcare reform legislation, there's a new developing entity, accountable care organizations, integrated delivery systems that are also taking financial risk, that will be making decisions about access that are based not only on clinical information, but also on the economics for them as well. And each of these players is going to have a slightly different point of view about things. They're going to have a slightly different business model in terms of how they make their money, and that's going to lead them to ask of you different things and ask for different information and either value your product more highly or more lowly. And so you want to think through the segmentation very carefully in order to develop your evidence plan. Your evidence plan is going to evolve over time. Before you come to launch and have your clinical trial data, you actually should be active in this space, and this should be a time when you're developing information about the disease state and the epidemiology, and you're in a position to understand for yourself both the burden of illness for the condition that you'll be treating and the unmet need. And moreover, you'll be starting to think about the positioning of your product as it relates to payers and others in the channel around this information and how they're going to think about it, right? As you come to launch and you have your clinical trial data, you will, of course, have that safety and efficacy data as a starting point. But also now with your burden of illness information and the epidemiology, you'll be able to do some forecasting and budgeting from the point of view of the payers. And these are typically called budget impact models. And so if I'm bringing a new molecule in the cardiovascular space, how many patients have this particular condition? How many of them, what might I penetrate? How many of these will go on? What's my pricing going to be? What is the net budget impact incrementally from a health plan perspective? And depending on what that is, you're either going to gather more attention from them perhaps or less, right? It's important, though, not to stop there. Over time, as you are on market, you have actually a chance to develop even more data over time around the economic information. It's hard sometimes to collect some of that economic information in your clinical trials, obviously, but once you hit the real world, this is where the payers really want to understand. It's great to see how this product worked in your clinical trials, and you say you've got all these great effects and all these medical offsets, fewer emergency room visits, fewer hospitalizations and the like. The reality now is different. Let's see what's happening in the real world, and let's prove it even in my own patient population. And obviously, from the payer perspective, the value of this information actually increases over time. And let me just show you a brief example then of how this can be applied. This is a disease state area that Genentech obviously plays in oncology, and it's an important consideration in this space. As you all know, the early initial trials for many oncology medicines are done in the metastatic conditions, and these are patients who oftentimes have failed other therapies. They have a very poor functional status, poor prognosis, and you're looking for a proof of activity, right, and initial safety and efficacy data. You're able to run a clinical trial in a fairly efficient manner in that kind of population, and so they make a good initial study population. The challenge from a payer perspective and a value perspective is your trial may show, for example, in a patient population that was going to die in 6 or 7 or 8 months, you've pushed that out to 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 months, right? And it's great clinically because now you got proof of concept and something to go with. But this is where you get the headlines, though, when you price this medicine for a small target population to recoup your costs of, oh gosh, we've got this cancer medicine, it's $5,000 a month, or it's $7,000 a month, or it's $100,000 a year, and it only improves survival 2 months. Is it worth it? And I think as an industry, we've kind of been in this space for some time actually right now. The good news is, and if you do the value calculations, that degree of clinical outcome for the cost, and here it's represented in the cost per quality adjusted life year. This is a measure that the payers use frequently to think about these things. That ratio is not good, right? You may be spending $150,000, $200,000, $400,000 per life year. That won't seem like a good bargain from their perspective and the other things that they can spend money on. The good news, though, or the opportunity, as I said, once you've reached market, you can continue to study this stuff, and you can take the same medicine, show it in an adjuvant population, much greater effectiveness, and you get a chance not only to expand your patient population, but also to recast your value proposition. So now, for those patients where you may be curative for some and extending survival by years, the ratio changes even if you haven't adjusted your pricing to a much more favorable manner. That's important to them because they're going to think differently then about enabling or not enabling access to your product. When it's a poor proposition, value proposition, as a payer, I'm going to set roadblocks in place. I'm going to control reimbursement to the providers in a way that may dissuade them. I'm going to require administrative hurdles, prior authorizations, meeting certain criteria, maybe formulary management and all those kinds of things. Once I get comfortable, actually, though, that your medicine is a reasonable value in a different population, and I see how the utilization is actually playing out in the real world, then I may reach a comfort level and back off from those things. And we actually have some great examples in our portfolio at Genentech where that has certainly been the case. All right, that's before coming to market, getting your value proposition for payers in order. As you come to market, I said there were 3 levers to think about: pricing, contracting, and distribution. We'll start with pricing. The initial thought, again, from a marketer at a company like ours may be, I love my product, it's got great data, everyone's going to love my product, and I'm going to extract as much value as I can. I'm going to price it as high as I can. Again, I think it's worth thinking twice. That may, in fact, be a good model for you, but there are exceptions to that. And you'll want to think through a number of things before you land on an eventual pricing model, right? So it is important to start with what launch to price do I think will maximize my net revenue. You need to think downstream, though, as well about launch price increase strategy over time. There are certain barriers in the market to price increases, and so whether you launch at a higher price and rely less on price increases or vice versa is an important strategic consideration. And obviously, you'll need to think about payers, but also those other stakeholders as well, PBMs and group purchasing organizations as well. And let me just show you an example of how this can play out as well. McKenna, is anyone here familiar with this product from the past, recent past? Okay, so this is a good illustrative story about pricing, a cautionary tale, perhaps about that positioning of pricing high to extract the value that I can. It's a progesterone product that's used to help prevent the risk of preterm birth in pregnancy. It was predecessed by a number of generic progesterone molecules on the market who were used for this indication, though they had never been studied and labeled. And they were put together in compounding pharmacies and then made available. The company saw the opportunity actually to do the clinical trials, do the drug development, get the regulatory filing and labeling and positioning in the market, and add value that way to the patients, but then also for themselves as well. And so they developed a branded product that would do that. They came to market and they priced it at a price that was 100 times the price of the generically available compounded generics. And as you can see, and this is just a snapshot of the headlines over time, it was breath-catching, at the beginning, but there was some sense that, well, maybe they're going to get away with this. But over time, the marketplace reacted, stakeholders reacted, and in fact, a backlash built. And so they had priced it at $1,500 an injection and felt that they could no longer sustain that, and they cut the price in over half in order to try to retrench in this marketplace and extricate themselves from this backlash. Unfortunately, it was too little too late. They were not able to recover. The FDA signaled that they were not going to police the continued availability of the compounded molecules, and they were going to continue to be available on the marketplace, and the company really never recovered from this. So it is worth thinking twice about your pricing strategy. It's worth thinking deeply, doing the market research that you need, and anticipating all these kinds of stakeholder reactions. The second lever I said in your go-to-market package is contracting. Again, the marketer with a lot of enthusiasm and optimism for the product would say, contracting, those are price concessions. Those are discounts I'm offering into the market. Why would I ever do that? I want to avoid them if at all possible. And that may be, again, a very good starting point, but it is worth thinking twice. Payers are going to have a positioning. They may be using formularies or prior authorizations or differential reimbursement in the way we talked about. It could have an impact on the uptake and utilization of your product. You need to ask yourself, will payer contracting offset any of that? And you need, again, to think through the other stakeholders in the value chain as well, the supply chain as well. Are there GPOs representing hospitals or doctors? And what do I need to do about that sort of thing? And let me just show you a brief example of a company that actually used contracting as a strategic lever in a positive fashion, right? So the last tale was a cautionary tale. This is one where it's an opportunity to use one of these levers. This is a market, a class of products that are quite similar. The green one on the top was the first-in-class market leader launched and got its leadership position. And we're looking at sales by quarter over time. The next two down were the fast followers. These were the products that came at a slight discount and but established themselves pretty quickly after the first one came in there, competed it out, and got some good market share. And the ones on the bottom were all sort of the later entrants, sort of the later Me Too's who never were able to differentiate themselves, except for the one in orange, right? They were going along kind of following the late entry Me Too kind of category, but they did a couple of things. The first thing they did was to make sure that their product actually was competitive with the class leaders. They created a new injection device to upgrade their product. But then the second thing they did was they launched an aggressive contracting strategy targeted at payers. They knew payers were managing the formularies here, and they were enabling access to some products and encumbering access to some of the other products. And so they said, if we can go in there and discount with those guys and get them to favor our product, maybe we can leverage that. And so they did that, and as you can see, it was quite effective. Over time, they substantially grew both their market share and their sales. And you see their quarterly sales here went up by about fourfold over time. And you might imagine, if you can grow your revenue 4 times, you can afford to give some discount to the payers in order to enable that, right? So here's an example of using contracting in a positive way. All right, the third bucket, or the third one in the go-to-market bucket was distribution. This will not be intuitive to a lot of folks in the room. Distribution is an afterthought for many products in the life sciences. It is getting increasingly important over time. We all know the starting point is going to be that product loves access, and that broad distribution and broad access will be my best or my default positioning. And that, in fact, again, may be the case, but it is, again, worth thinking twice. There are some trade-offs to be made in the management of your distribution channel. The access we talked about, broad distribution, broader access, but in order to enable that, you give up some control. Once you get your product out there, and we've seen some of this recently with some of the knockoff products in the U.S. market that have come to FDA attention. If you put your products out there more broadly, you lose control over what's where in the distribution channel. You may also lose control over the data that you want back from those channel partners to help you understand your sales and your targeting strategy. And the last thing you trade off, in addition, so access and control, but the third is support. It's also true that many of these channel partners can help you by providing support services for your product in ways that you as the manufacturer aren't going to be able to do. And let me show you a couple of examples of these trade-offs. The first is a company with a REMS program. They have a requirement for a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy from the FDA. They need control. They need to be able to control how their product is being utilized in the marketplace. And so they set up a model that solves for that. They contracted with an exclusive specialty pharmacy, so one specialty pharmacy, one distributor for the entire country. And the way the product flow works is that the healthcare practitioner decides to prescribe the medication. They contact the specialty pharmacy and enroll the patient. The specialty pharmacy confirms that back with the physician and then reaches out to the patient. And this is the first opportunity actually for a value-add service. That specialty pharmacy now can educate your patient and prepare them for the things that they need to deal with in coming onto this medicine and being both compliant and adherent with it, right? They also wrapped a second service around this, and that is helping folks navigate their reimbursement. They put in a reimbursement center through the specialty pharmacy that would contact the insurance company on behalf of the patient and make sure that all that was going to work and that the reimbursement was going to flow well. And then lastly, they closed the loop with a value add back to the healthcare practitioner to let them know, we've solved for all of this, your patient has access to the product, it's being shipped, and we will continue to monitor things. So here's a model that is not broad, it's not solving for broad access, but it is giving great control and some great support services as well. So this is one example how you can leverage your distribution model. Here's another one, specialty pharmacy example again. I mentioned earlier that the value of some of these support services. This is some data looking at adherence programs through specialty pharmacy. You see on the left the blue line for the decay rate, the adherence over time, and you can see on the right when the specialty pharmacy implements a program for an intervention group, how they can shift that curve upwards and to the right, and they can improve adherence over time. You can imagine for a product with a lot of sales, this is very, very, very valuable. All right, so that's distribution, and that's the second bucket. So we talked about value proposition and evidence support for payers upfront to get your coverage right. Then we talked about go-to-market strategies, pricing, contracting, distribution. And I said earlier that even when you get all that stuff right, it's still complicated. There's still gaps in insurance or people who are underinsured and don't have insurance and they need help. And this is where you'll start to think about those reimbursement support programs. The default position may be, particularly for early stage companies, that this is a nice to have, and I'll think about this later when I'm a bigger company. I would propose actually it's a pretty big deal depending on the space that you're in. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. healthcare system can be hard to navigate. If you're in a space where you're targeting small populations and therefore generally have to charge higher prices, that fragmentation and those gaps, the effect of those things is greatly magnified. And the value of an individual patient, pulling them through, is also greatly magnified. And so even if you get your access strategy as right as you can get it up to now, as we've been talking about, it's worth layering on an intense reimbursement support service to do all that hand-holding and to pull these people through. And generally, there's three components to that. A contact center that will help folks navigate their insurance, contact their insurance company on their behalf, and then inform them about the information there. Some form of copay support. Co-insurance and copays are growing in this country, and many times people can't afford those, and they're a big hurdle, particularly for targeted therapies. And then lastly, the free product for patients who either don't have insurance or who have been denied. It's important to healthcare practitioners to have confidence that when they want to use your product, regardless of the patient's ability to afford it, regardless of their insurance status, they're going to be able to use it. You'd like to encourage a mindset where you're in this with them and you're going to help take care of those patients. And let me just give you a final example of the potential value of reimbursement support programs in this way. So this is some market data looking at reimbursement confidence, the prescriber confidence in accurate and timely reimbursement from payers in a particular disease category and a variety of medications. The one on the left that they have the highest confidence in is a very low-cost generic-like medicine. So you can imagine not much financial risk to them, not much hurdle from the payer perspective, high degree of confidence I'm going to get reimbursed and it's not going to be a problem. The three in the middle are established branded products that have been kind of duking it out in the competitive market arena for some time, all of which are operating very substantial, sophisticated reimbursement support programs. And you can see they don't do quite as well on reimbursement confidence as the low-cost generic-like product, but they do fairly well. And there are some differences, right? More robust programs or better operated programs perhaps seem to make a difference. And then on the right, we have a new entrant who came to the market a bit later, doesn't yet have all the payer policy and all the coding in place and all the things that we've been talking about up to now. It's created some confusion in the marketplace. Their reimbursement support programs are not as well established yet. Doctors' offices and patients don't know where to find them, how to access them, and how to best interact with them. And you can see all of this complexity is substantially reducing the prescriber confidence. You might imagine it makes a big difference. When doctors are thinking about what medicine to start for this patient, I have a series of choices here. Is my reimbursement confidence higher or in the middle or lower? And so getting those things right, again, I would say is worth thinking twice. And so just to wrap up then, we talked about a framework, a simple framework for simplifying some of this complexity, thinking upfront about your value proposition and the evidence that you're going to develop to go to payers, get the best coverage you can. Then when you come to market, being thoughtful about your pricing and contracting and distribution decisions and looking actually for opportunities to use those as levers. And then on the back end, even once you've done those things as best you can, there's still going to be patients that have gaps. And what can you do from a reimbursement support perspective to help pull those patients through one by one? I'm going to close with just a final words of advice for early stage companies and entrepreneurs. Obviously, my main positioning here is it's worth thinking about this stuff. Put yourself in the position of those other stakeholders in the value chain, identify with them, listen to them, go out and meet with them, do some market research, be thoughtful about these strategies, and be smart, make good decisions, realize that there are trade-offs and you're optimizing, sometimes not just maximizing. And lastly, I didn't spend a lot of time on it here, obviously, but this environment is full of a host of regulatory and other governmental considerations, and it's really, really important to take those things seriously and do them right and do all of your government price reporting and all your regulatory compliance efforts in this space in a very robust fashion as well. And so I would close with saying, get good counsel, as we saw in the last section about intellectual property. The value of getting good counsel in that space is quite high. I would say it's equally high in this space. It's likely for early stage companies that you don't have a lot of homegrown expertise on your teams yet. There is expertise in the market. I would generally counsel you It's likely not the big consulting houses, the McKinseys and the Bains and the places that I would look for if I were in your shoes. There are, though, individuals who have worked in this environment throughout their careers and who are now out there sharing their pearls, their wisdom with companies in earlier stages. And if you find the right ones of those, they can be much more accessible, much more less costly, and able to tailor their advice really to your situation. And lastly, I would say it may be even that if you're in a very early stage company, thinking about this is like too far off in the future, and in which case it isn't so much get good counsel and preparing to do this yourself. It may be, though, get good counsel and thinking about this in terms of your partnership opportunities going forward, right? There are companies, established companies in the industry that play in different arenas here, are more skilled in some areas than others, depending upon their product portfolio and the way they've come to market in themselves over time. And this can be a big differentiator for you. It can be a big enabler or a big encumbrance for you as your product comes to the market. It can be a big value creator or value destroyer. And so think about your partners in this as well. All right, so let me close there, and we'll invite our panelists up. Okay, welcome everyone. As we did in the last session, why don't we start off with some introductions? If you could all briefly introduce yourselves and the company you're with and what you're working on.
Hello, my name is Christine Bund. I'm the CEO and founder of Integra Biomedical. We are developing a combination product consisting of a novel cancer therapeutic that acts on cancer stem cells and a companion diagnostic for triple-negative breast cancer. We're based in Boston. I guess I'm sitting here because I spent 15 years in big pharma, first Hoffmann and Roche in Switzerland, and then Merck and Company in White House Station, and I had the pleasure, and sometimes not so much pleasure, dealing with payers worldwide.
Hi, I'm Danielle Zarochik, and I'm CEO and founder of WeCare, and I design and break down the barriers to high cost and high technology medical devices in order to make globally inexpensive and affordable devices. Our first device is a negative pressure wound therapy device, and basically reduces the cost by over 1/10 and takes the high electrical requirement down to a mechanical device. And I just returned from a clinical trial in Rwanda to prove out the concept in a phase 1.
Yeah, I'm Steve Rosenberg. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at CardioDX. We're a molecular diagnostics company, uses genomic information to try and come up with better decision-making in the cardiovascular field. And I've been lucky enough to be involved with 2 products that are, some being reimbursed, some not, but both work and are being used to help patients.
I'm Sean Duffy. I'm founder and CEO of digital health company Omada Health. We've built a web program for people with prediabetes to help them reduce their risk of converting to type 2 diabetes. I'm on this panel, I think, because we want our app to be considered as a therapy for people with prediabetes. And it seems like the world of digital health is moving in the direction of apps and services being actually prescribable. So when they first invited me to be on the panel, I actually tried to say no, but Dominique promised me I could contribute value. So up here representing the software side.
Good. All right. Well, listen. Thanks everyone for joining us. Steve, let me. We're going to start with some facilitated questions here. Let me start with you, perhaps, in the diagnostic space. The diagnostics market is, from a reimbursement perspective, oftentimes even more complex, I'd say, in some ways than what we just talked about. And sometimes you hear people talking about the second valley of death, actually, as they bring their diagnostic products to the market. Can you tell us about the lag time that sometimes exists between initial approval and really establishing yourself in the marketplace and some of the things that you do to try to bridge that?
Sure. So the FDA has been remarkably opaque in trying to decide how they want to regulate complex in vitro diagnostics based on multiple analytes. That is, not measuring a single thing, but measuring many things and using equations then to relate those to healthcare outcomes. That being said, they're using what they call enforcement discretion to enable you to be on the market, but not requiring clearance or approval. what that has done is created more complexity from a payer perspective, because you can launch then a product. There's no guaranteed approach to whether you get paid or not. And different payers all have different views. And one of the things payers require is a sort of set of data that you need to have. These are analytical validity of your test, the clinical validity, does it do what you say it does clinically? But beyond that, they want to know about clinical utility. This was a point that was raised earlier, which is, does the test in the real world, not in a clinical trial setting, actually change the way physicians and patients act? And from a payer point of view, that's really important because that drives the economics. And what they want, and what the payers want to see is, yes, the science in clinical medicine makes sense, but also that there's an economic story that says not only do you do better medical care, but you do it cheaper. And the challenge you have is for you, especially as a small company, to start off saying, okay, why should Aetna listen to me when I call them up and say, I want to talk to you about our new product? They'll say, no one uses it. We don't know anything about it. We don't believe your technology. And why should we spend money on this? I mean, and they're in the position of saying no. That's really their role. And what you need to do then is to then set up a commercial infrastructure so you can sell your product. You are then doing this under a circumstance where you almost certainly have a negative gross margin. That is because you're selling a product, your physicians are using it, it costs you money, but you're not getting paid for it at all. It's one of the wonders of the American healthcare system, that you can deliver a service and not get paid for it. And the challenge you have is that you need to establish use and some real-world clinical utility that you and your investors are basically financing. In some cases, this can run $50 million worth of stuff. I know in at least one company's case, the amount of money that their investors ate over a several-year period in the oncology space was greater than $50 million before they got broad reimbursement. So that's really the second value of death in the financing environment over the last few years. It wasn't, could you develop a product? People said, great, you developed a product. They said, well, does anyone use it? You say, yeah, we have thousands of people using it. But they say, well, are you getting paid for it? And if the answer to that was no, you had a very difficult time getting financing. So that was the second valley of death, as I think I called it.
Good, thank you. Okay, so Danielle, why don't we turn to you? The medical device space is also a bit different from the biopharma space. Reimbursement there for many of those devices actually is through DRGs, diagnostic-related groups. Could you share with us a little bit about how DRGs work, and also with a product like yours that you've priced much lower than the standard of care, how that works and how that fits for you?
Yeah, so basically what I did is I looked at the reimbursement strategy of that technology, and it was limiting to patients because of they weren't getting reimbursed for it, so it limited the amount of patients that could get reimbursed for it. So that was actually in my design process, is what price point did I need to meet in order to meet the broader patient population, and also what the issue with us is we're not saying you have to pay this higher price in order to get this value. So we're not claiming value. It's our clinical data is really important to show that we're equivalent to the current devices, and how do you prove that out? Mm-hmm. And the buyers or the payers, as far as convincing them of that. Mm-hmm. And so in medical devices in general, I guess in order to come up with a new device, it's very hard to enter into a market where a device exists if you're not meeting price points that are significantly less.
Yeah. And part of that is because you're dealing not only with the payer as an economic decision maker, right, but also the provider.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the hospital has got a constrained amount of money because of this diagnostic-related group reimbursement for the whole episode of care. Now, the flip side of that, though, is it could create opportunity, right? And are you taking advantage of that?
Yeah, so right now, basically having discussions with those groups is very important upfront before you finalize device and start manufacturing. And so that's really the position I'm at right now, is tweaking the device for manufacturing, and these conversations are actually very important as far as what they're looking for in your device before you spend the money to actually market and make that device.
Right. So you've got a pricing decision to make where a lower price to a provider, economic decision maker, right, which is in a very powerful position to influence product choice. A lower price will enable their adoption, right, but potentially leave money on the table for your company.
Yes, and also they might also be looking for a specific part of that device technology-wise, that if it's not there, they wouldn't be willing to pay for it no matter what costs you're charging. So.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. All right, Christine, you said your company is developing a targeted medicine that could be a real breakthrough for some patients with breast cancer. And I understand that before you even licensed the intellectual property for this particular product, that you actually went out and talked to some payers about it. Could you tell us why you did that and what you learned and how that could be important?
Well, so it's very good to start in a current environment if you have a really predictive test to identify a relevant patient population which would benefit from the medicine. And in fact, I think in the future, if you don't have that, you might be in trouble. I actually just attended a panel in Boston. There was a discussion. I got this question, Christine, why don't you, in this capital-constrained environment, drop the companion diagnostic and just launch the therapeutic? It would be faster to market. My reply was, I'm not sure I would be successful and actually pass diligence even of very smart investors who recognize that this is very, very important. To your question, I think it's very important that you start thinking very early about reimbursement, even if you do indication choices. So we had a couple of discussions with some payers and also some former colleagues from pharmaceutical companies, because if you have choices, look at the competitive pipeline and who's out there. Are there targeted therapies already approved in a certain indication? Then you're going to compete with them. So you have a far better starting point to obtain reimbursement if you have no competition. So that was one important consideration, and also one driver other than the science. We have a target which is highly expressed in triple-negative breast cancer, but currently there's almost only chemotherapy approved, and there are no targeted treatments available. So if you come with those arguments to the table for negotiation, you have a completely different starting point.
Yeah. Good. So even in an area with high unmet need and a targeted therapy, depending upon whether you're in a competitive environment or not, there may be certain pricing bands out there and expectations that you need to be prepared to deal with, even in that environment.
So a couple of considerations, and Scott, you mentioned that already. In terms of pricing, and certainly in areas which have a lot of mortality associated with it, chronic diseases such as cancer, you have to consider early access programs for those who cannot afford care. That's critical. You have to think about that early and factor that into your pricing strategy.
Yeah, good. Okay. So, Sean, let's turn to the disease management area. Again, a different vertical here and a very interesting one, I think, from a reimbursement perspective. The disease management market is one that historically has been kind of hard to break into. There are a lot of companies have tried. Some have had some success, some less so. I'd be very interested to hear, how you're thinking about this. I know from the payer perspective, when I worked in that environment before, we sometimes, again, kind of to Steve's point, started from a point of view of some skepticism, and moreover, even a point of view perhaps that we're kind of already paying for this anyway, right? We're paying the provider system really to deliver good care and to coordinate all that care. And so what's different about your program that I ought to think about reimbursing it?
Exactly. So we actually don't think of ourselves as a disease management company at all. The background is we started at Omada Health thinking about how we could help entities that see the cost of diabetes avoid the cost of diabetes, right? So the 10-year net present value of avoiding a conversion from prediabetes to diabetes is enormous. It's $55,000. And the question for us became is how can we show a 3-year, inside a cost savings inside of 3 years for an entity that might pay for this, and leverage existing evidence that shows that it's possible to help people with prediabetes not get diabetes. And so really there was this landmark clinical trial called the Diabetes Prevention Program that finished up in 2002. And what they did is they took people with prediabetes through a 16-session lifestyle course and watched what happened to their conversion over the years. And at 3 years, the risk reduction was 58%, and at 10 years, 30%. So really, the clinical results were so good that if that program were a pill, right, if it were some sort of therapy, it probably would have been commercialized, probably through some of the same complicated channels that you discussed earlier. Right, but it wasn't a pill, so the question became, how do you bring that to the world? So for us, kind of our vision is to kind of change the provider framework of what we're doing, so they think of us as a therapy. So it's something that a doctor could find someone with prediabetes and actually prescribe us as a reimbursable therapy. Now that's kind of a long-term vision for a company. In the short term, we need to sell through channels that can see 3-year cost savings, and so it's almost a question of being a cost savings intervention versus a cost effective intervention.
And so tell us how your conversations with payers are typically going.
So we started, even before we incorporated, we were having conversations with payers. There's a national diabetes prevention effort that's just spinning up right now with the NIH, CDC, in partnership with United Health Group, some of the Blues plans. And so we started talking to some of these folks that are thinking about prediabetes and interventions as something that should be down the road paid for by Medicare, and hopefully that would trickle down. So it's hearing their perspectives made us really think that it is possible to really pull this off. I mean, there's an increasing recognition that we can't, as a nation, watch everyone with prediabetes go convert to diabetes.
And is the primary way that you and your company are gaining payer insights, is it through these sort of one-on-one discussions with payers, or are you doing any market research or other avenues?
Well, so it's a bit of both. I mean, it's one-on-one. There's really for us, there's kind of three entities we're interested in. Payers can either serve as, in the fully insured market, they can serve as the entity that actually pays for it. In kind of the TPA roles they serve, they can serve as a distribution channel to self-funded employers who are increasingly looking at their diabetes costs and wanting to do something about it. So it's kind of a combination of payer and distribution. And then there's other interesting models too. I mean, in a world where increasingly global contracts are being negotiated for delivery organizations and they're seeing the costs of diabetes more directly, we can sell directly into those entities. And by referencing this amazing body of clinical literature that has already been completed and is very well trusted, and just trying to deliver some of those fundamentals in a different way, we've been able to get some interest there in those groups as well.
Yep. Anyone else with any other ways that they try to gather insights from the payer world, or really from the value chain generally?
So one of the things we did early on, a year before we launched our product, we hired our first reimbursement person.
Yep.
Just to get those relationships started, to try and understand just as you do customer research, you need to do payer customer research and say, what are you looking for in terms of an evidence package? When will you look at evidence? One of the things that was a bit of a surprise, I think, was that payers in general will only look at published literature. If it's not published in the peer-reviewed literature, they won't look at it. Doesn't matter if it's been presented at ASCO, or AHA. If it's not published, they say they want that second step of peer review. And that can add a year to when you get reimbursed. A year you probably are, if you're burning millions of dollars a month, you probably don't have. So that's an interesting challenge.
Anybody else with creative approaches?
I wanted to just offer another alternative, because as we're sitting here in a cash-strapped environment and we're thinking market research and those sort of things, it's hard to do for startups.
Right.
One of the very simple things you can do is talk to your customers, i.e. your physicians, the people who prescribe the product, especially in the device world. So Intica is not my first company. My first company is Taurus Biomedical, based in Lexington, Massachusetts. They're in 2B development. for interstitial cystitis with a drug-device combination product. If you go to a urologist and you ask them how would they use the device, they got entire sheets out with CPT codes. You could identify your codes. You could plot it all together. So you had half of your reimbursement strategy already there. And it's very important that your product fits into a setting where your customers can make money as well. That's important too.
Yeah, great point.
My first step in designing the device was actually interviewing doctors, nurses, and patients and payers from the U.S. developing world and military, because those are the markets I was targeting. And that really drove my functional requirements for my initial design.
Yeah, interesting. I think the point about how important it is to have a business model where the other stakeholders and downstream customers and ultimately the providers can make money as well is a really, really important one. We see it in our space for the buy and bill products, and that's where in particular these decisions about pricing, initial launch price, price increase strategy, any discounts that you provide into the market, because they get wrapped into government benchmark prices and those kinds of things that lower reimbursement eventually, and even your distribution model and how you control that and manage that as well. All impact sort of downstream profitability for other players. And it's very nuanced, really important to get all that stuff right. That's a great insight.
One of the things with new technology is you can't always have a distribution channel. So, in fact, the way we run our current test is that all the physicians who order it send their samples to Palo Alto, where we run it in a CLIA laboratory. And what that means is it makes it very difficult to have the customers, in this case physicians, have a stake in our product. As a matter of fact, we're in some ways taking away what they're getting if they have imaging equipment, for example, in their office. You say, well, don't use your imaging, your nuclear camera. Send our sample because we're better for the patients, we have more accurate data, et cetera. But it can be a hard sell.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it underscores then how your value proposition may be different for different players in that value chain, right? Because your value proposition to the payer may be, I can help you better risk stratify patients here with cardiac symptoms and get them more efficiently treated, save you costs. But when you're talking to the cardiologist, he may view it more as a threat and say, hey, I've got all this technology, all these services I can do. That's not a saver for me.
Yeah, we actually see that payers can really be a driver of new technologies in medicine because of the need to bend the cost of healthcare.
Right.
It gets a little complicated with the physicians because they have different, we could talk about it, every example has pluses and minuses.
So Steve, are you, how are you going about collecting data and evidence to back up this sort of value proposition for these kinds of patients?
So, I mean, we started off by doing really prospective clinical studies showing, yes, we can measure in peripheral blood gene expression patterns, whether someone has coronary artery disease or they don't. So that was really a requirement, and we published that a few years ago. But then we started using strategies which are much less intuitive from a sort of hard science perspective, which is to ask, for example, okay, patient comes to see you. You, as a cardiologist, make a decision what you think is going on with them, what your usual care mode is. You then run our test. You then say, okay, do I change my mind about what I was going to do or not, and how often? Because that says, okay, there's clinical utility because you're willing to make a change in your patient management based upon this new information. Then you also need to show, as subsequent study, and we did that as a prospective study, then you need to show, does it save money? And then you get into some of the exact same things you were talking about.
Yeah, so you're looking at impacting the diagnostic patterns, or referrals and utilization of different tests, but then also potentially downstream cost offsets from reductions in...
Yeah, I mean, it depends on whether you're looking at cost effectiveness or budget impact,
Yeah.
right? Long term, you're looking at how often does someone go to have an angiogram. Angiograms are pretty safe, but there is a rate at which you have bad side effects from it, like bleeding.
Yeah.
And then you also have to say, well, if you're getting people who wouldn't have been diagnosed do you prevent people from having heart attacks down the road? But the real value of our test is actually 90% of the people who show up with symptoms suggestive of coronary disease actually don't have coronary disease. And we can rule those people out very effectively. That's not the way you usually think about medicine, as not doing things. As a matter of fact, we as a society are really bad about saying, okay, I don't need anything done. Everyone says, I want the latest test, I want the latest drug, I want the latest this. And of course, that's extremely expensive, and that's what we pay for.
Right. Interesting. So Sean, how about your area? This business of developing evidence obviously is an important one.
Yep.
And you said that, your company's work is, foundational to that actually was a huge multi-year government-sponsored, set of trials with a very robust evidence base. Is that sufficient in order for you guys to craft your value proposition and tell your story, or are you also collecting other bits of information?
I mean, we'll collect other bits of information, and down the road we may run a trial to show that we can hit the same primary weight loss endpoint outcomes as the original diabetes prevention program. But it's been enormously important. And I mean, the reality of kind of what we're doing is I don't think we could have a business without the original DPP and kind of some of the translation efforts that have happened consequently, because it's really tough. It would be incredibly tough for us to build the ROI studies that show cost effectiveness and cost savings. It would be tough for us to explain that this could actually work without being able to point to it. So our real challenge is, first, we need to adhere to and abide by the fundamentals of this original behavioral intervention, which is made a little bit easier because the CDC's created a standards body to recognize organizations as delivering a DPP-style lifestyle intervention. So we can point to that. And then just convince folks that even though we're not exactly the same, because we're doing this all over the web, and it's a different modality, even though it's not exactly the same, it's close, and it's worth giving it a shot, because the alternative is very often setting up an on-the-ground program, which is difficult and tough to scale.
And how mature is your evidence around your particular application yet?
We're very early. Our company is
Yeah.
brand new. I mean, we're a year old. We're still kind of in the seed funded stage, and so we do have. I mean, we have a pilot in progress right now with 230 people with prediabetes going through, and so we're collecting great data through our digital, cell phone enabled scale and all sorts of things like that. So we can point to that in progress, and that's actually been enough for us to set up pilots and get some rollouts going.
And in the meantime, are payers reimbursing?
It's looking like it's heading in that direction. The first markets that we're going to start with are really it's the self-funded employers.
Yeah, gotcha.
Because they see cost of diabetes, and it's a little bit easier to get a pilot set up in that realm. But that's not our long-term vision, to stick only in that channel.
Okay, so it sounds like you're working on navigating your version of Steve's Valley of Death as well. And so good luck with that. Christine, we're just talking about how hard it can be to collect this kind of evidence. The regulatory burden for safety and efficacy in the FDA and all can be very high. This is a little more nebulous, right? And so do you have any tips for how companies can think about this and plan for it, and where you might look for data?
Yeah. So unfortunately, in the United States, I think, and I hope you agree, we are dealing with a little bit with a moving target, because the reimbursement environment is changing.
Right.
So you actually can learn from ex-US countries. Think about the UK, Germany, Australia, where you have to actually support health outcome studies to get reimbursement and to maintain reimbursement. So there are a lot of experts who are pointing out that this is sort of the general direction the US is heading for. So I give you one specific example actually in our field. As I mentioned, our first targeted indication is triple-negative breast cancer. There are new guidelines just issued throughout ASCO which support an accelerated approval in this field. Only one randomized trial, a histological endpoint, all wonderful, no refractory metastatic population. You can go into early high-risk breast cancer patients triple negative in this case. So that's all wonderful from an FDA track. Now, I'm thinking payers, are they going to care about the histological endpoint? I don't think so.
Right.
So the FDA still requires you to collect survival data. So it's very important to think about outcomes and also economical outcomes, not some sort of benefit or clinical endpoint. And start thinking about that also already in preclinical development. What data can you, for instance, with a novel therapeutics, from a safety perspective, collect, which will strengthen your argument?
Good. And we're going to open up for questions. In the meantime, Christine, let me just one follow-up to that. You've done this in both large companies and small companies now. Speaking to kind of smaller company environment, entrepreneurs, earlier stages, any bits of advice about how to do this economically?
Yeah, it's obviously tough for small companies because I mentioned it, the budgets are smaller. If you do market research, as we know, it costs a lot of money. So another important group we haven't discussed yet are your key thought leaders. So work with them.
Yep.
They have great ideas there. They work with other larger companies who can give you advice, and patient advocacy groups. So especially in rare diseases, take them to the negotiation table. Use any kind of leverage you can get. So those would be some additional advice I could offer.
Good. So again, talk to your customers, talk to your key opinion leaders, and get their point of view. Okay, questions? Yep, Tom? Oh, up front here?
Hi, my name's Amal. So it's nice to see digital health being represented here. So I have a question. So given there's so many apps and so many different devices, do you see that the validation for reimbursement for digital health type of things, can that be short-circuited just based on real-world evidence without going to sort of, so if you have, say, 50,000 users of your app, and you can show that, hey, there's a decrease based on what they were before and after, does that allow you to go straight to payers? Is that ever going to happen, or is that just never going to happen and you have to go through the RCT? And the second part of the question is, if once you do have the validation, how much time do you actually save for building those reimbursement relationships to get to the point where?
I mean, I guess it's still an evolving landscape, so I don't know if anyone can answer that exactly right. My feeling is you do need the evidence, and it needs to be attached to some sort of a clinical outcome. That's just kind of the way it's kind of the way we're approaching it, and there's some other digital health companies that are thinking about that as well, and I think I feel like that's the way it'll probably go. I mean, a lot of these, also for digital health technologies, a lot of these trials aren't going to be outrageously expensive, right? I mean, it's, for what we're doing, I think if we ran some sort of trial to compare ourselves and benchmark ourselves against on-the-ground brick-and-mortar diabetes prevention efforts, we're talking $500,000, which is obviously a lot of money, but it's not what you might see if you're trying to run a trial with a huge, a therapeutic. So my feeling is yes.
All right. So I just point of view from somebody who's, again, worked at a couple of health plans, I would say you're absolutely right. This is an evolving field, and I think it remains to be seen. It's a little bit like when payers were first started, being asked a few years ago to start paying for email exchanges, right, between doctors and patients. And so time will tell. My belief is they'll largely start from a point of view of skepticism. The background in healthcare from their point of view is that incremental things and incremental services add costs until proven otherwise, basically, from a cost perspective. From the administration perspective, they also add complexity administratively. They have to deal with very broad provider networks, and they have to deal with certain regulatory rules, insurance rules in each of the states that they operate about fairness and all those kinds of things. And so what's my basis for choosing to reimburse Sean's program but not reimburse your program or someone else's? And so their starting point is often, I just don't want to open this up, because if I open this thing up, it's just going to go all over the place, and it'll be very hard for me.
And on that exact point, I mean, that's where I think evidence becomes increasingly helpful, right? 'Cause
Absolutely.
If I show up and I'm like, look, we've got this
Yeah.
trial, another company shows up and they have kind of similar results, then they might both be paid for, right?
Yeah,
I think the other thing, though, is that someone touched on is outcomes. The whole question about whether you will be asked to prove that what you're doing is better than present standard of care in a randomized clinical trial is a very difficult one, because that can cost not $500,000, but $100 million to run that trial.
Yeah.
And there's a big, one of the things that has been ongoing is whether there isn't a role for the National Institutes of Health and other private partnerships with governmental organizations to fund those sorts of trials, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of innovation which is never going to see the light of day. You can get a surrogate endpoint that sort of bootstraps you into it, maybe, but at the end of the day, that's really the gold standard, and whether you'd be held to that with new technology is a debate in many fields, I think, today.
Okay, our next question in the back.
I just had a comment for all the panel members about, we're talking about payers, but I'd like to see what your thoughts are about consumer-driven healthcare and directly marketing to the individual, because a couple of the
Yeah.
panel members, Sean, Steve,
Yeah.
and probably Dominique, you could sell directly to
Yeah.
the individual, and I think that's growing, high deductible plans, health savings accounts, and that hasn't really been addressed much. We keep talking about these big payers.
Yeah.
We have to get approval from payers. And I see a model where that's going to go away. I mean, I think targeting to the individual is what's coming. People argue patients they don't know if they need a chorus, lab test or with We Care, an ulcer. But I think that's coming,
I think there's some regulatory issues with that. The FDA really isn't in favor of direct-to-consumer marketing as much as they can control it. I mean, some of the instances around, personal genomics and what 23andMe and other people have done has gotten the attention of the regulatory authorities because it isn't clear they've ever done the trial to show it makes a difference. And so, that it's the wild, wild west, I think, to some degree out there, and how it will evolve is going to be interesting.
Sean, you've probably thought about that, right? You could either seek reimbursement at payers or go to the consumer route.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about this too, and a piece of it is obviously the price point, right? That you would charge to the end user, and for us, the price point we charge to the end user and kind of a B2B customer. It's not absolutely unreasonable. I mean, we're talking like maybe a little bit more expensive than Weight Watchers. So I do think for a certain segment of people who know already that they're at risk for diabetes and they want to kind of take control of that and really figure out a way to work with some sort of program to address that. There is a market there. It's not kind of core in our strategy. I think our goal is for us to have something that's effective and engaging and can really do its job. It needs to be so enriching and interesting to go through that it needs to feel like the sort of thing you'd want to pay for anyway. So once we've got that up, I think we'll prototype that channel and try selling direct to consumer. And if it turns out to be a big success, that's great. But right now, it's just not our core focus.
Yeah. Okay. Others here?
Hi. I have a question that's probably a little more relevant to devices, but can you speak about the sort of reimbursement price, the thoughts that you have to have on reimbursement and pricing when it comes to, say, building a better mousetrap that fits into an existing CPT code? I'd imagine that there would be constraints there, but I was also curious about the potential possibilities that you have.
Yeah. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Danielle, do you?
Yeah. Well, there's whenever I first started designing this device, so it's purely mechanical, and the code is actually for an electrical device. And during my design process, there's actually a code that was issued recently for mechanical devices, which good for me, right? I didn't have to go through that. But originally, I was trying to talk at least to the right people to understand what technology-based points I needed to meet to fit that code that existed. And it made my device a little bit more expensive if I needed to meet those endpoints. But now, since this other code exists, I could reach the endpoints I actually wanted to reach. So I think it really plays into your design. And if you're if you expect to be reimbursed under a specific code, you should probably know whether your design's going to be, your end product's going to be reimbursed or not under that code
Yeah.
before you actually go down the path of making it and trying to sell it.
And one other strategy that people have used is to stack codes so that you have multiple steps in your process, each of which gets reimbursed. Different payer organizations have taken either DIM or other views about that. And the alternative is really to use a miscellaneous code, which gives you a lot of pricing flexibility, but there's no precedent for what you should get paid or whether it'll get supported.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to really show value, oftentimes a miscellaneous code is a good strategy. But then eventually that's all changing under the new coding guidelines, which are coming out in the next few years.
Yeah, I think this is a really important gap in the healthcare finance system, actually. There are tremendous constraints to the coding processes and the administrative systems that, process claims. They don't provide the degrees of flexibility that are required actually to support the proper use of products in all their applications. You can imagine a company that's, developing an agent that has immune actions or whatever that might be used in cancer, might be used in RA, might be used in inflammatory bowel disease or whatever. It could be used in different dosages, have different value propositions for all of those, and you just don't have the flexibility in the coding and systems to administer all that, and you end up having to pick sort of a compromised, optimized program that doesn't really fit any of them well, and can lead to pretty substantial dislocations in the marketplace over time if you're not really smart and savvy and thinking about that stuff.
One last question.
Hi. Question about contacting payers. So we have a clinical oncology diagnostic. It took a bit of time for us to interview a few dozen clinical oncologists, but it didn't cost us any money. But then when we started thinking about payers, one afternoon with a reimbursement consultant was $1,000, and we have a few $100,000 in funding. That's pretty expensive for us. Can you give a little bit of advice to the beginner on how to make those first few contacts with payers without having to pay?
You get what you pay for? Is that
Yeah.
Dive into your network. It's probably very, very likely that some of fellow entrepreneurs, CEOs know some sort of a payer. You have to do the legwork, get the introductions, and follow up. That's the simplest way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I do think generally you will find some members of that audience who will be willing participants. You'll find some chief medical officers or chief pharmacy officers or others where this is kind of a fun intellectual exercise for them and a bit of a diversion perhaps from their day job. And if you do the right networking and can get the introductions, my guess is you can find some people that actually will be willing to sit down and talk with you. Okay. All right. Well, listen, thanks very much to our panelists. I really enjoyed learning about all the different verticals here and how these reimbursement issues apply in your space. And thank you all for your attention and for your questions as well.